he did the unthinkable. He looked down at the burning wreck, saw his wingman trapped inside, and made a decision that violated every military rule in the book. He didn't radio for help. He didn't fly back to the carrier. He nosedived his own perfectly good fighter plane into the side of a frozen mountain behind enemy lines, just to hold his dying friend's hand. In 1950, in a country torn apart by segregation, a white man sacrificed everything for a black man. This isn't a movie. This is the most insane, heartbreaking true story of brotherhood in American history. Before we take off, I want a roll call. This story is about real American grit, and I want to know who is standing watch with us today. Go down to the comments and drop your city and your age. Let's see which generation and which part of the world is keeping the memory of these heroes alive. They told him that gravity worked differently for a black man in Mississippi, that the mud of the Delta was designed to hold his feet, while the sky was a domain reserved for those with lighter skin. They said his destiny was written in the calloused hands of his father and the endless white rows of cotton that stretched to the horizon. In the 1930s, in the heart of the Deep South, the laws of physics seemed secondary to the laws of Jim Crow. For a boy like Jesse Brown, the world was a cage built of unwritten rules and terrifying boundaries. To step out of line was to risk a beating. To dream too big was to invite death. But Jesse Brown had a secret. While everyone else was looking down, trying to survive the day, he was looking up. And what he saw up there wasn't just empty space. He saw the only place in the world where a man could truly be free. Imagine Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in the depths of the Great Depression. It was a place where the social atmosphere was as stifling as the humid air. Poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a weapon used to keep the black population in a state of perpetual servitude. Jesse's father, John Brown, was a sharecropper, a man who worked land he didn't own for a profit he rarely saw. He was a hard man, forged by the brutal realities of his time. He loved his children with a fierce, protective intensity, but that love often looked like fear. He taught Jesse the rules of survival. Step off the sidewalk when a white person passes. Never look a white man in the eye. Keep your head down. Do your work. Stay invisible. In John Brown's world, invisibility was the only armor against the lynch mob. But Jesse was different. Even as a child, working long hours in the corn and cotton fields under the baking sun, there was a fire in him that the damp earth couldn't extinguish. He was an athlete, fast and strong, but he was also a scholar, a boy who devoured books by the light of a kerosene lamp when the day's work was done. He read about the Great War, about the aces who dueled in the clouds above Europe. He read about Eugene Bullard, the black expatriate who flew for France when his own country wouldn't let him serve. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were fuel. There is a story often told about a day in the fields when Jesse was just a boy. The drone of an engine cut through the silence of the afternoon heat. High above, a biplane, a rare sight in rural Mississippi, banked and turned against the blue canvas of the sky. The other workers kept their heads down, their rhythm of picking uninterrupted. But Jesse stopped. He stood up, shielded his eyes, and tracked the plane as it danced among the clouds. His father famously scolded him, telling him to get back to work, telling him that the sky wasn't for the likes of them. But in that moment, a seed was planted that no amount of hardship could root out. Jesse Brown decided, with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a child, that he would not just watch those planes, he would fly them. But having a dream in Mississippi and realizing it were two very different things. The path from a sharecropper's shack to the cockpit of a fighter plane didn't exist. It had to be carved out of solid rock. The first obstacle was education. The schools for black children were underfunded shacks, open only when the harvest allowed. But Jesse pushed himself. He walked miles to get to school. He excelled in mathematics, knowing instinctively that the language of flight was the language of numbers. He became a star athlete in high school, a football player whose speed and agility made him a local legend in the segregated leagues. Yet, even as he excelled, the ceiling was always there. He watched as white boys, less talented and less intelligent, were given opportunities he was denied. He saw the way the local police looked at him, not with admiration for his athleticism, but with suspicion. A strong, smart black boy was dangerous. He was a threat to the order of things. Jesse learned to mask his intelligence, to wear the mask that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote about, smiling when he wanted to scream, acting deferential when he felt superior. It was a performance required for survival, but inside, the pressure was building. He knew he had to get out. If he stayed in Mississippi, the gravity of the place would crush him. His escape hatch appeared in the form of a college application to Ohio State University. It was a bold, almost reckless move. Ohio was in the north, the promised land, but it was still a world away from the red clay of Hattiesburg. When he was accepted, the triumph was mixed with a harsh reality. His family had no money to send him. His father, despite his fears, saw the determination in his son's eyes. He emptied his pockets, scraped together what little savings he had, and sent Jesse north. It wasn't enough to pay for tuition, housing, and books, but it was enough to buy a train ticket and a chance. Jesse arrived in Columbus, Ohio, in 1944. He had escaped the legal segregation of the South, only to find the de facto segregation of the North. He could sit anywhere on the bus, but he couldn't live in the dorms. He could attend classes with white students, but he was barred from their fraternities and social clubs. He was isolated, broke, and working countless hours loading boxcars on the night shift just to pay his tuition. He would finish classes, run to the rail yard, work until his muscles screamed, catch a few hours of sleep, and do it all over again. Most men would have broken under the strain. Most would have looked at the mountain of obstacles and decided that maybe his father was right. Maybe the earth was where he belonged. But Jesse was fueled by a singular obsession. He walked past the local airport on his way to work, watching the planes take off, whispering to himself, "One day." He knew that the military was slowly, painfully opening its doors. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven that black men could fly in the Army Air Corps. But Jesse had his eyes on something even more exclusive, something harder, something that had never been done before. He didn't want to just be a pilot. He wanted to be a naval aviator. The Navy was different. The Army had accepted black pilots into segregated units, but the Navy? The Navy was the citadel of tradition. There had never been a black pilot in the history of the United States Navy. The Naval Aviation Cadet Program was the elite of the elite, reserved for the best physical specimens and the sharpest minds white America could produce. To apply was audacious. To expect to get in was delusional. Jesse Brown applied. He walked into the recruiting office at Ohio State, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a sea of white faces. The recruiter looked at him with disbelief. He was made to take entrance exam after entrance exam, subjected to physicals that were more rigorous than those given to his white counterparts. They were looking for a reason, any reason, to disqualify him. A heart murmur, a flat foot, a hesitation on a math problem. They wanted him to fail. They needed him to fail, because if he passed, they would have to deal with the problem of integration in the cockpit. But Jesse didn't fail. He aced the exams. He crushed the physicals. He presented a profile of such overwhelming competence that the Navy, bound by its own regulations, had no choice but to accept him. When the letter arrived, accepting him into the V5 Aviation Cadet Training Program, it was a victory that felt like a declaration of war. He wasn't just joining the Navy, he was invading it. He packed his bags, leaving behind his life as a student and a laborer. He wrote to his childhood sweetheart Daisy, back in Mississippi, promising her that he was going to make something of himself, that he was going to build a life worthy of her. He didn't tell her about the fear. He didn't tell her that he knew he was walking into a lion's den. He was heading to Glenview, Illinois, and then to the training bases in Florida, where the instructors were waiting for him. As the train carried him toward his destiny, Jesse looked out the window at the passing American landscape. He saw the farms, the cities, the people who didn't know his name and didn't want him to succeed. He touched the acceptance letter in his pocket, feeling the paper that proved he was more than a sharecropper's son. He remembered the plane over the cotton field. He remembered his father's warning. And he made a vow to himself, staring at his own reflection in the glass. They could break his body, they could break his heart, but they would never, ever break his wings. He was going to fly, or he was going to die trying. The earth had held him long enough. It was time to claim the sky. The train ride to the training base was the last moment of peace Jesse Brown would know for a very long time. When he stepped onto the platform at the Naval Air Station, he wasn't just stepping into a military base. He was stepping into a hostile ecosystem designed to purge the weak. And in the eyes of the United States Navy in 1946, being black was the ultimate weakness. He was entering a world of white uniforms, white faces, and white supremacy that had been codified into tradition for over a century. The acceptance letter in his pocket got him through the gate, but it didn't buy him a single ounce of respect. To the instructors and the other cadets, he was an anomaly, a clerical error, a social experiment that they were determined to correct. The training program for a naval aviator is widely considered one of the most grueling physical and mental challenges in the world. It is designed to wash out the vast majority of applicants. It takes the best and brightest college athletes and breaks them down, forcing them to prove they have the right stuff to land a screaming metal bird on a pitching deck in the middle of the ocean. For a white cadet, the pressure was immense. If he failed, he went home to his parents, disappointed, but still a man. For Jesse Brown, the calculus was entirely different. He wasn't just representing himself. He was representing every black man who had ever looked at a plane and been told no. If he failed, if he washed out, it wouldn't be seen as an individual failure. It would be weaponized as proof that his entire race lacked the intelligence, the coordination, and the courage to fly. He was carrying the weight of history in the cockpit with him, strapped in right alongside his parachute. The hostility began immediately, but it wasn't the loud, burning cross racism of Mississippi. It was colder, sharper, more professional. It was the racism of the silent treatment and the impossible standard. In the classroom, instructors would look right through him. When he raised his hand, he was invisible. When he gave an answer, it was scrutinized for the slightest error, while white cadets were given the benefit of the doubt. He had to be perfect. He memorized the manuals, the engineering schematics, the meteorology charts until he could recite them in his sleep. He couldn't afford to be average. Average was a death sentence for his career. But the real torture happened in the air. Flight training is intimate. It's just you and an instructor in a small, noisy cockpit, communicating through a headset. For Jesse, that headset was often a conduit for abuse, or worse, absolute silence. Some instructors refused to teach him. They would take him up, fold their arms, and wait for him to make a mistake that would kill them both, betting on their ability to grab the stick at the last second. They wouldn't give him the tips and tricks they whispered to the white cadets. They wanted him to quit. They wanted him to panic. They would cut the engine without warning, putting the plane into a spin, screaming into the headset to see if the boy would crack. Jesse didn't crack. He had learned the art of stoicism in the cotton fields. He masked his fear with a mask of cold, professional detachment. When the engine cut, his hands moved over the controls with a fluid grace, restarting the prop, leveling the wings, bringing the bird back under control. He learned to fly not because he was taught, but because he studied the machine with a lover's intensity. He learned to feel the air over the wings, to listen to the hum of the engine. He forced the instructors to pass him, not because they liked him, but because failing him would have been a lie so obvious it would ruin their own reputations. The social isolation was perhaps harder to bear than the flying. In the mess hall, he ate alone. In the barracks, conversations would die when he entered the room. He was surrounded by hundreds of men his own age, men he was supposed to trust with his life. Yet he was on an island. He wrote letters to Daisy every night, pouring his heart out onto the paper, telling her about the clouds, the speed, the beauty of flight, but leaving out the crushing loneliness. He couldn't let her know how hard it was. He had to be her hero. Those letters were his lifeline, the only place where he could take off the mask and just be Jesse. There were physical hurdles too, designed to weed out those who weren't amphibious. The Dilbert Dunker, a contraption that simulated a plane crash at water, was a nightmare for many. They would strap you into a mock cockpit, drop you into a pool, flip you upside down, and expect you to unbuckle and swim out before you drowned. The stereotype of the time was that black people couldn't swim, that their bone density was too high, that they would sink like stones. The instructors watched Jesse with crossed arms, waiting for the panic. Jesse Brown didn't just swim, he moved like a seal. He had trained his body just as he had trained his mind. He exploded out of the water, gasping for air, looking the instructors in the eye, daring them to find a flaw. Then came the rumors, the pseudo-science of the day. Whispers in the medical wards that black pilots would black out sooner under G-forces because their blood vessels were different. It was nonsense. Racism dressed up as physiology, but it meant that every time Jesse pulled a high G turn, every time the blood rushed from his head and his vision tunneled, he had to fight harder than anyone else. He had to clench his muscles, grunt through the maneuver, and refuse to pass out, knowing that if he went unconscious for even a second, it would be written up as a genetic defect. He fought gravity with pure willpower. As he progressed from the basic trainers to the more powerful aircraft, the stakes got higher. He was moved to the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, the cradle of naval aviation. Florida was the Deep South. Outside the gates of the base, he was just another black man in a Jim Crow state. He could fly a warplane at 300 miles per hour, but he couldn't buy a sandwich at the lunch counter in town. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. Inside the cockpit, he was a god, soaring above the petty hatreds of the earth. On the ground, he was a second-class citizen. This duality tore at him, but it also fueled him. The sky became his sanctuary. Up there at 10,000 feet, there were no whites-only signs. The clouds didn't care about his race. The wind didn't check his ID. The final hurdle before earning his wings was carrier qualification. Landing a plane on a runway is hard. Landing a plane on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean is a controlled crash. It requires nerves of steel and split-second timing. The landing signal officer, LSO, stands on the deck with paddles, guiding the pilot in. If the pilot is too high, too low, too slow, the LSO waves him off. For Jesse, the fear was that the LSO would wave him off even if he was perfect, that the bias would extend to the very edge of the deck. He approached the carrier, the USS Wright, his engine roaring, the deck pitching in the swell. He was alone in the cockpit, the radio crackling in his ear. He could see the tiny strip of steel that was his target. He focused. He shut out the instructors, the racism, the loneliness. He became one with the plane. He lined up the approach, watched the paddles, cut the throttle at the exact right moment, and slammed onto the deck. The tailhook caught the wire. The plane jerked to a halt. He had done it. He had done what they said a black man couldn't do. He taxied the plane to the parking spot, shut down the engine, and sat there for a moment as the prop spun down. He was sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked out at the ocean, endless and blue. He had run the gauntlet. He had walked through the fire and hadn't been burned. He had proven that excellence has no color. But as he climbed out of the cockpit, stepping onto the deck of the carrier, he knew the war wasn't over. He had won the battle for his wings, but the battle for acceptance was just beginning. He was about to enter the fleet, to join a combat squadron, and there he would meet men who had never seen a black officer. Men who would look at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Among them would be a man named Tom Hudner, a white boy from Harvard, who had everything Jesse didn't. Their collision course was set, but for now, Jesse Brown stood on the flight deck, the wind whipping his flight suit, a conqueror of the air, the first of his kind, ready to pin the gold wings of a naval aviator to his chest. He had forced the Navy to open the door. Now, he was going to walk through it. October 1948. The air at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville was thick with humidity and history. On a parade deck polished to a mirror shine, a formation of young men stood at rigid attention. They were the survivors. They were the ones who hadn't washed out, who hadn't cracked under the pressure, who had mastered the art of aerial warfare. They were all white, except for one. Standing there, his back straight as a plumb line, his chin raised, was Ensign Jesse Brown. When the designated officer stepped forward and pinned the gold wings of a naval aviator onto his chest, a camera shutter clicked, capturing a moment that shattered 173 years of tradition. Jesse Brown had done the impossible. He was officially the first African-American carrier pilot in the United States Navy. The press was there. Photographs of Jesse appeared in newspapers across the country, touted as proof of American progress. Life magazine would eventually feature him. He was a symbol, a poster boy for a new integrated military. But symbols don't have to eat lunch alone. Symbols don't have to endure the silence that falls over an officers' club when they walk in. The gold wings on his chest commanded a salute from enlisted men, but they couldn't force his fellow officers to invite him for a drink. The victory was public, but the battle remained intensely private. He had climbed the mountain, only to find that the air at the summit was thin and cold. He was an officer and a gentleman by act of Congress, but in the eyes of the society he served, he was still a second-class citizen in a gold-buttoned uniform. But Jesse had a secret source of strength, a rebellion that he kept hidden from the Navy brass. Her name was Daisy. In the rigid world of the mid-century military, cadets and junior officers were often discouraged or outright forbidden from marrying during training. The Navy wanted their undivided attention. They wanted them married to the service. For a black officer, the scrutiny was even more intense. Any deviation from the rules could be used as an excuse to discharge him. But Jesse loved Daisy with a fierce, defiant passion. She was his connection to the earth, his reminder of who he was beneath the uniform. They had married in secret, a clandestine ceremony that was as much an act of resistance as it was an act of love. Daisy was his anchor. While the Navy tried to mold him into a weapon, she reminded him that he was a man. When he was exhausted from the racism and the pressure, he would find his way to her, and in her presence, the mask could come off. They were building a life in the shadows of the regulations, a private world of tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the hard, cold metal of his daily life. When their daughter, Pamela, was born, the stakes raised again. Now, he wasn't just flying for his race or his pride. He was flying for her future. He had to come back. He had to survive. And survival was not guaranteed, because the Navy had assigned Jesse Brown to fly the F4U Corsair. To call the Corsair a plane is an understatement. It was a beast. It was a predator made of aluminum and steel, designed around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the most powerful engine in the world at the time. It had a nose so long that when the plane was sitting on the deck, the pilot was practically blind, staring up at the sky, unable to see what was in front of him. To compensate for the massive propeller, the designers had bent the wings into a distinctive gull shape, giving it the silhouette of a bird of prey. The Japanese called it whistling death for the sound air made rushing through its oil coolers during a dive. The Americans called it the Ensign Eliminator. The Corsair was notorious. It was fast, lethal, and unforgiving. If you punched the throttle too hard on takeoff, the torque of the massive engine could flip the plane upside down before it even left the ground, grinding the pilot into the tarmac. Landing it on a carrier was a terrifying dance with death. Because of the long nose, you couldn't fly a straight approach. You had to come in on a curve, banking hard at the last second to see the deck, snapping the wings level just before the wheels touched the steel. If you were too slow, you stalled and died. If you were too fast, you missed the wire, crashed into the barrier, and died. Assigning Jesse Brown to a Corsair squadron was a test within a test. It was as if the Navy was saying, "Okay, you got your wings. Now let's see if you can handle the Widowmaker." But Jesse didn't just handle it. He fell in love with it. The Corsair demanded perfection, and Jesse was a man who had lived his entire life striving for nothing less. He loved the power of it. He loved the speed. When he was strapped into that cockpit, looking out over the bent wings, he was the master of the most sophisticated machine of war on the planet. The plane didn't care about his history. It didn't care about his skin. It only cared about his hands and his mind. If he treated it right, it gave him the power of a god. He was assigned to Fighter Squadron 32, VF-32, stationed aboard the USS Leyte. This was the big leagues. The squadron was a fraternity of elite pilots, men who walked with a swagger that came from knowing they were the tip of the spear. Entering the ready room of VF-32 was like walking into a lion's den. These men were competitive, loud, and tightly knit. Jesse walked in, and once again, he was the only spot of color in the room. The dynamic in the squadron was complex. Pilots are pragmatic people. They care about competence above all else. When they saw Jesse fly, when they saw him grease a landing on a pitching deck or hold a tight formation in turbulence, they respected him. You can't fake it in a Corsair, but respect is not the same as acceptance. There was still a distance, a polite gap that separated Ensign Brown from the rest of the boys. They would brief with him, fly with him, and fight with him, but the camaraderie stopped at the door of the officers' club. He was with them, but he wasn't fully of them. He navigated this minefield with a quiet dignity that unsettled some of the white officers. They expected him to be angry, or subservient, or grateful. Instead, he was calm. He was professional. He spoke the king's English, dressed impeccably, and flew like a demon. He refused to let them see him sweat. He knew that they were waiting for him to slip, to act ghetto, to confirm their biases. He gave them nothing but excellence. But excellence is a lonely companion. On the carrier, surrounded by thousands of men, Jesse Brown lived in a solitude that few could understand. He would stand on the fantail of the ship at night, watching the phosphorescent wake churned up by the screws, thinking about Daisy and Pamela back home. He wondered if it would always be like this, if he would always be the first, the only, the outsider. He wondered if there would ever be a time when he could just be a pilot, without the adjective black attached to it. He didn't know it yet, but that isolation was about to be breached. A transfer order had been cut. A new pilot was coming to VF-32, a man who was his polar opposite in almost every way. Thomas Hudner was coming from Fall River, Massachusetts. He was a product of Phillips Academy and the United States Naval Academy. He was white, wealthy, and privileged, a man for whom the system had been built, door by door. On paper, Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner had no business being friends. They came from different planets. One was the son of a sharecropper who had clawed his way out of the mud. The other was a son of the establishment who had glided through the halls of power. But they shared one thing. They were both naval aviators. They both worshipped at the altar of the Corsair. And they both possessed a quiet, internal code of honor that was about to be tested in the frozen mountains of a country neither of them could find on a map. As 1949 turned into 1950, the world was holding its breath. The Cold War was freezing over. In Korea, the communists were massing at the border. The USS Leyte was being prepped for deployment. Jesse Brown was ready. He had his wings. He had his plane. He had his family to fight for. He had proven he belonged in the sky. Now, he was about to find out if his country, and the men flying on his wing, would be there for him when the sky fell down. The collision course was set. The sharecropper's son and the Harvard man were about to meet, and the history of the United States Navy would never be the same. Thomas Hudner arrived at VF-32 with the pedigree of an American prince. He was a man who had never known the sting of a racial slur, never been denied a seat at a table, and never had to question his place in the world. Born into the old money of Massachusetts, educated at the prestigious Phillips Academy and the United States Naval Academy, he was the living embodiment of the system that had systematically excluded men like Jesse Brown for nearly 2 centuries. He was handsome, athletic, and carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone for whom doors simply opened. When he walked into the squadron ready room for the first time, he was walking into a room full of men who looked just like him, sounded just like him, and shared his background, except for one. The meeting between Ensign Brown and Lieutenant's junior grade, Hudner, was not an explosion. It was a quiet alignment of 2 very different stars. On the surface, the distance between them was measured in light years. One was the son of a sharecropper who had picked cotton until his fingers bled. The other was the son of a grocery magnate who had grown up sailing on the Atlantic coast. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1950 America, they shouldn't have even been speaking to each other, let alone trusting each other with their lives. But the cockpit of a Corsair is a great equalizer. It strips away the accident of birth and leaves only the essence of ability. Hudner watched Jesse. He didn't watch him with the suspicion of the instructors in Florida or the disdain of the bigots in the mess hall. He watched him with the analytical eye of a professional. He saw how Jesse handled the plane. He saw the meticulous way Jesse inspected his aircraft before every flight, touching the rivets, checking the hydraulic lines with a reverence that bordered on religious. He saw how Jesse briefed a mission, his voice calm and authoritative, his math flawless. Hudner realized very quickly that this man wasn't just a black pilot. He was an aviator who had fought harder to get into that seat than anyone else in the room. And for a man like Tom Hudner, who valued character above all else, that earned a respect that went deeper than rank. Their friendship began in the spaces between the noise. It started with the professional courtesies of the ready room, the debriefs after training flights, the shared complaints about the temperamental engines of the Corsairs. But it grew during the deployment to the Mediterranean in late 1949. The USS Leyte was sent on a show the flag cruise, a diplomatic mission to demonstrate American power in Europe. For the white pilots, it was a grand tour, liberty calls in Cannes, parties in Naples, drinking wine and chasing girls. For Jesse, it was a minefield. Even in Europe, the shadow of American racism followed the fleet. While the French and Italians were often fascinated by and welcoming to the black pilot, the ship's protocols and the attitudes of some fellow sailors created a buffer of isolation. Jesse couldn't always go to the same bars. He had to be careful about where he walked and who he spoke to. He carried a constant, low-level tension, always scanning the room for the look or the word that would turn a pleasant evening into a confrontation. Tom Hudner began to see this. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he was looking at the world through the eyes of a man who wasn't welcome in it. He saw the quiet indignities Jesse swallowed every day. He saw the way Jesse would excuse himself early from events where he sensed he was merely tolerated, retreating to his cabin to write letters to Daisy. And Hudner made a choice. It wasn't a grand political statement. He didn't stand on a table and give a speech about civil rights. He simply decided that he would rather be with Jesse than with the crowd. They became section mates. In the air, they were inseparable. A flight section is the fundamental unit of aerial warfare. 2 planes, a leader, and a wingman, tied together by an invisible cord of mutual defense. The leader hunts. The wingman protects the leader's back. They flew wingtip to wingtip, separated by only a few feet of rushing air, their lives depending entirely on the other man's competence. In the air, Jesse Brown was often the section leader. He had more time in the Corsair, more experience with the beast. Imagine the subversion of that image. A black man leading a white man through the clouds, issuing commands that the white man instantly obeyed. Break left. Climb. Attack. Inside the squadron, the racial hierarchy of America was inverted. Competence was king, and Jesse Brown wore the crown. There is a specific kind of intimacy that forms between men who fly high-performance aircraft. It is a brotherhood forged in the awareness of death. The Corsair was dangerous even when no one was shooting at it. Engine failures, hydraulic leaks, carrier landings gone wrong. Death was always sitting in the jump seat. Jesse and Tom shared this proximity to the void. They learned the rhythm of each other's voices over the radio. They learned to read the subtle movements of each other's planes. They became extensions of one another. Tom met Daisy when the ship was in port. He saw the love between them, the daughter, Pamela, whom Jesse adored. He realized that Jesse wasn't just fighting for a career. He was fighting for a legacy. He was building a world for that little girl where the sky was open. Tom Hudner, the bachelor from New England, found himself fiercely protective of that dream. But the Mediterranean cruise was the calm before the storm. The world was shifting on its axis. In June 1950, far away on a peninsula in Asia that most Americans couldn't identify, the North Korean People's Army surged across the 38th parallel. It was a blitzkrieg of Soviet-made T-34 tanks and hardened infantry, crushing the South Korean defenders and the small contingent of American advisors. The Cold War had suddenly turned hot. The United Nations called for a response. President Truman ordered the military to intervene. The police action, as it was euphemistically called, was a desperate scramble. The U.S. military had been drawn down after World War II. It was understrength, ill-equipped, and unprepared for a ground war in the mountainous terrain of Korea. The call went out to the fleet. The USS Leyte, which had been enjoying the sun of the Mediterranean, was ordered to steam at full speed toward the Pacific. The mood on the ship changed overnight. The party was over. The pilots of VF-32 stopped talking about girls and started talking about close air support. They studied maps of a rugged vertical landscape, place names like Seoul, Incheon, and the Chosin Reservoir. They swapped their dress whites for flight suits and survival gear. For Jesse and Tom, the abstract drills of training were replaced by the grim reality of killing. They were no longer just flyers. They were about to become warriors. The journey to Korea was long and tense. As the Lady transited the Suez Canal and crossed the Indian Ocean, Jesse Brown wrestled with his own demons. He knew the statistics. The life expectancy of a combat pilot is measured in missions, not years. He thought of Daisy and Pamela. He had broken every barrier to get here, to this specific point in space and time, only to face the very real possibility that he would die for a country that still forced his wife to sit in the colored section of the bus. It was a bitter pill, But Jesse was a professional. He wrote home, projecting strength and confidence. "I think we're going to be able to help out a lot over there," he wrote. He focused on his job. He focused on his section. He focused on Tom. Tom Hudner, for his part, watched his friend closely. He saw the weight Jesse carried. He knew that Jesse felt he had to be the best pilot in the squadron, not just for his own survival, but because he was the first. Every bomb he dropped, every strafing run he made, would be judged. Tom decided that his job was to make sure Jesse didn't have to carry that weight alone. He would be the wingman who never blinked. He would cover Jesse's 6 o'clock against the MiGs and the ground fire. He would be the shield. By October 1950, the Leyte was on station in the Sea of Japan. The air was turning cold. Winter was coming to the Korean peninsula, a winter that would become legendary for its brutality. The North Korean army had been pushed back, but a new threat was looming. Intelligence reports whispered of massive Chinese troop movements crossing the Yalu River. The pilots were briefed that the war might be almost over, a home-by-Christmas fantasy that was about to be shattered by 1,000,000 Chinese soldiers. On their first combat missions, Jesse and Tom saw the face of the war. It wasn't the clean dogfights of World War I. It was dirty, low-level work. They flew Close Air Support, CAS, acting as flying artillery for the Marines on the ground. They dove their Corsairs into narrow valleys, strafing enemy trucks, dropping napalm on troop concentrations, flying so low they could see the faces of the men they were killing. It was terrifying work. The ground fire was intense. Small arms, anti-aircraft guns, flak. The mountains were treacherous, filled with downdrafts and hidden peaks. In the crucible of combat, the bond between the sharecropper's son and the Harvard man hardened into something unbreakable. They communicated telepathically. When Jesse rolled in on a target, Tom was right there, suppressing the anti-aircraft fire. When Tom pulled up, Jesse was watching his tail. They were a single organism of aluminum and adrenaline. They racked up mission after mission, destroying bridges, supply convoys, and artillery positions. Jesse Brown became a terror to the enemy on the ground. He flew his Corsair with a violent grace, pushing the machine to its limits. But as November deepened, the temperature plummeted. The Siberian winds swept down from the north. The Chosin Reservoir froze solid, and the trap was sprung. The Chinese army emerged from the snow, surrounding the 1st Marine Division and the Army's 7th Infantry Division. The frozen Chosin campaign began. The Marines on the ground were fighting for their lives, encircled, outnumbered, and freezing to death. They looked to the sky for salvation. And looking down from the cockpits of their blue Corsairs were Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner. The stakes had never been higher. The Ensign Eliminator was about to be tested against the harshest environment on Earth, and the friendship between two men was about to be pushed to the ultimate breaking point. The playground of the sky was gone. This was the killing jar. By late November 1950, the Korean War had ceased to be a military campaign and had become a humanitarian catastrophe played out in a freezer. The Chosin Reservoir is a man-made lake high in the mountains of North Korea, a place of jagged peaks, narrow, winding roads, and winds that blow down from Siberia with the force of a banshee's scream. That winter, the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero. It was a cold so profound that it froze the oil in the guns, the plasma in the medical kits, and the flesh of the men huddling in the foxholes. And into this frozen cauldron, the United States had marched 30,000 men, mostly the 1st Marine Division, straight into a trap set by 120,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. The Chinese plan was simple and ruthless: encircle the Americans, cut off their supply lines, and annihilate them to the last man. They attacked at night, waves of white-clad soldiers emerging from the snow like ghosts, blowing bugles and whistles, overrunning the freezing American positions with sheer numbers. The Marines on the ground were fighting for their lives, inch by icy inch. They were surrounded, outnumbered 4-1, and running low on ammunition. Their only link to the outside world, their only hope of survival, was the thin blue line of aircraft circling overhead. For Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner, the war had shifted from strategic bombing to a desperate daily rescue mission. They weren't hunting strategic targets anymore. They were hunting survival for their brothers on the ground. The pilots of VF-32 were flying close air support in the truest, most terrifying sense of the phrase. To be effective, they had to get down into the mud with the infantry. They couldn't drop bombs from 10,000 feet. They had to thread their Corsairs through narrow granite valleys, flying lower than the mountain peaks, dodging power lines and rocky outcroppings to deliver napalm and high explosives within yards of the friendly lines. The flying conditions were atrocious. The decks of the USS Leyte, stationed in the Sea of Japan, were covered in ice. Launching a Corsair, a plane with massive torque and a tendency to bounce, off an icy deck in gale-force winds, was a feat of airmanship that defied physics. Every takeoff was a roll of the dice. If the catapult failed, if the engine sputtered in the cold air, the plane would plunge into the freezing black water and the pilot would be dead from hypothermia within minutes. Jesse Brown strapped into his cockpit every morning, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his hands numb in his gloves, knowing that the ocean wanted to kill him before the Chinese even got a chance. But once they were in the air, the real nightmare began. The Chinese troops were masters of camouflage. They wore white quilted uniforms that blended perfectly with the snow. They hid under white tarps during the day, becoming invisible to the high-flying jets. The only way to find them, the only way to stop them from overrunning a Marine platoon, was to fly low and slow. Jesse and Tom would bring their Corsairs down to treetop level, roaring through the valleys at 300 knots, their heads on a swivel, looking for tracks in the snow, for the glint of metal, for the muzzle flashes of enemy guns. This was the most dangerous flying in the world. At that altitude, a pilot isn't just vulnerable to anti-aircraft missiles. He is vulnerable to everything. A single soldier with a rifle, a lucky shot from a machine gun hidden in a tree line, could bring down a multi-million-dollar aircraft. They were flying into a wall of small arms fire, a sterile term for thousands of bullets filling the air like a swarm of angry bees. Jesse Brown flew with a ferocity that awed his squadron mates. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to be the underdog, to be surrounded and outnumbered. When the forward air controller, FAC, a Marine on the ground with a radio, called for help, screaming that they were being overrun, Jesse didn't hesitate. He would roll his Corsair over, dive into the teeth of the flak, and unleash hell. The whistling death lived up to its name. He dropped canisters of napalm that tumbled end over end, exploding in blooms of orange fire that incinerated the Chinese waves and melted the ice. He fired his 20mm cannons until the barrels smoked, chewing up trucks and roadblocks. There was a psychological weight to this combat that was heavier than the G-forces. The pilots could see the men they were protecting. They could see the desperate faces of the Marines looking up from their frozen foxholes, waving their arms, cheering as the blue planes roared overhead. They were the angels of Chosin. The bond between the air and the ground was sacred. Jesse knew that if he missed, if he dropped a bomb short, he would kill his own countrymen. If he pulled up too early and missed the enemy, the Marines would die. He flew with a precision born of intense pressure. He was flying for the reputation of his race. Yes, but in those mountains, he was flying for the 19-year-old kid from Kansas, shivering in a sleeping bag, who just wanted to go home. Tom Hudner flew on Jesse's wing, a constant, silent guardian. He marveled at Jesse's aggression. Jesse would push his plane to the limit, diving deeper into the valleys than the regulations advised, staying on target a second longer to ensure a hit. Tom's job was to watch Jesse's back, to call out the tracers arching up from the snow, to suppress the enemy gunners trying to draw a bead on the lead plane. They developed a rhythm, a deadly dance. Jesse would break left. Tom would break right. Jesse would strike. Tom would cover. They were a single entity, a two-headed dragon breathing fire on the frozen hills. The Chinese hated the Corsairs. They learned to fear the dark blue silhouette against the gray sky. They set traps for them. They would position machine guns on the ridges, creating flak traps in the valleys, waiting for the planes to dive. They knew the Americans relied on air power, and they were determined to bleed the Navy white. Every mission resulted in planes coming back with holes in their wings. Rivets popped. Plexiglass shattered. The ground crews on the Leyte worked around the clock, patching the aircraft, reloading the guns, scraping the ice off the wings. It was a relentless, grinding war of attrition. By early December, the situation on the ground was critical. The Marines were fighting their way out, conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the port of Hungnam. It was one of the most brutal marches in military history. They were walking through a gauntlet of fire, carrying their dead and wounded. The road was narrow, icy, and surrounded by high ground held by the enemy. If the Chinese could blow a bridge or block the road, the entire division would be slaughtered. The Corsairs were the only thing keeping the road open. They were the flying artillery that smashed the roadblocks and silenced the mortars. December 4th, 1950. The day dawned cold and gray. The mission briefing in the ready room of VF-32 was somber. Intelligence reported heavy Chinese concentrations near the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines were taking heavy fire. They needed close air support immediately. Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner suited up. They pulled on their poopy suits, heavy rubberized immersion suits designed to keep them alive for a few minutes if they crashed in the freezing ocean. They grabbed their charts, their pistols, and their helmets. As they walked to their planes on the flight deck, the wind was howling. The Lady was pitching in the rough seas. Jesse climbed into his Corsair, painted with the number 203. He strapped in, connected his oxygen mask, and gave a thumbs up to the plane captain. The massive engine roared to life, spitting blue flame. One by one, the Corsairs of VF-32 roared down the catapult and leaped into the gray sky. They formed up and headed inland, climbing over the jagged, snow-covered peaks of North Korea. Below them, the world was a monochromatic landscape of white snow and black rock. It looked lifeless, but they knew better. It was teeming with 100,000 men trying to kill each other. They arrived over the target area near the reservoir. The forward air controller radioed them. "We have enemy troops moving on the ridges. Many of them. Search and destroy." Jesse acknowledged the call. "Roger, I see them." He signaled his division, Tom Hudner and 2 other pilots, to follow him down. They dropped from the sky, swooping low over the desolate terrain. They were looking for targets of opportunity. Chinese infantry, trucks, artillery. They were flying at barely 1,000 feet, sometimes lower. The ground rushed by in a blur. They saw footprints in the snow, the telltale signs of enemy movement. They saw the dark shapes of soldiers diving for cover. Jesse led the pack. He was aggressive, banking his Corsair hard to get a better look into the deep ravines. He wasn't dropping bombs yet. He was hunting. He wanted to be sure. He flew over a ridgeline, exposing the belly of his aircraft to the ground for a fraction of a second. It was a routine maneuver. He had done it 100 times in the last month. But war is a game of probabilities, and eventually, the numbers turn against you. Down in the snow, a single Chinese soldier, perhaps freezing, perhaps terrified, raised his rifle, or perhaps it was a light machine gun crew tracking the noise, and fired a burst into the air. It wasn't a wall of flak. It wasn't a guided missile. It was just a piece of lead, fired blindly into the sky, but it was enough. Tom Hudner, flying off Jesse's wing, saw nothing unusual at first. No explosion, no smoke, just the blue planes dancing over the white snow. But then, over the radio, Jesse's voice came through, calm but tight. "I think I may have been hit. I'm losing oil pressure." Tom looked over at Jesse's plane. At first, it looked fine, but then he saw it. A thin, dark trail of smoke streaming from the cowling of the engine. It wasn't a fire, not yet, but it was the lifeblood of the aircraft bleeding out into the slipstream. The mighty double wasp engine, the heart of the Corsair, had been pierced. The oil pressure gauge in Jesse's cockpit was dropping towards zero. Without oil, the engine would seize. It would turn into a hunk of dead metal. And a Corsair without an engine is not a glider. It is a falling brick. They were miles behind enemy lines. The terrain below was a nightmare of steep, forested slopes and deep snowdrifts. There were no runways. There were no flat fields. There was only rock and ice and the enemy. "I'm losing power," Jesse radioed. His voice didn't crack. He was a naval aviator, trained to handle emergencies. But Tom could hear the tension. The engine was beginning to sputter, the propeller slowing down. The plane was starting to descend, settling toward the unforgiving earth. "Pick a spot, Jesse," Tom radioed back, his heart hammering in his chest. "Pick a spot and put her down." Jesse scanned the terrain. It was all bad, but he saw a small clearing on the side of a mountain, a bowl-shaped valley covered in deep snow. It was surrounded by trees and rocks, but it was the only option. He lined up the approach. He had to crash land a 12,000-pound fighter plane, laden with fuel, onto the side of a mountain at 100 miles per hour. He jettisoned his external fuel tanks and his rockets to reduce the risk of explosion. He lowered his flaps. He braced himself. Tom Hudner and the other pilots circled overhead, watching helplessly. They saw Jesse's plane skim the tops of the pine trees, shearing off branches. They saw it slam into the snow. The impact was violent. The Corsair gouged a deep trench in the earth, threw up a cloud of white powder, and then buckled. The fuselage snapped behind the cockpit. The nose slammed down. The plane came to a rest, a broken, smoking wreck in the middle of the silent, frozen wilderness. For a moment, there was no movement. The radio was silent. The pilots circling above held their breath, praying to see the canopy open, praying to see Jesse climb out. They waited. And then the canopy slid back. Jesse waved. He was alive, but he didn't climb out. He sat there, in the open cockpit, in the freezing wind. He looked around, then looked back up at the sky. He waved again, but this time the wave was different. It wasn't a wave of reassurance. It was a wave of distress. Smoke began to curl up from the nose of the plane. A fire had started, and Jesse Brown wasn't moving his legs. Tom Hudner looked down at his friend, his wingman, his brother. He saw the smoke thickening. He saw the isolation. He knew the Chinese were likely moving toward the crash site right now. He checked his fuel. He checked his own safety. And then he made a decision that would defy every regulation in the book. A decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't going to watch Jesse die. If the system wouldn't save him, if the world wouldn't help him, then Tom Hudner would go down there and do it himself. The Harvard man keyed his mic. "I'm going in," he said, and he pushed the nose of his Corsair down toward the snow. To say that Thomas Hudner's decision violated military protocol is an insult to the magnitude of what he did. There is no manual in the United States Navy that covers intentionally crashing a fully functional fighter plane onto the side of a mountain behind enemy lines to save a wingman. It was an act of insanity. It was an act of love. It was a suicide pact made without a word. The other pilots circling above, watching their radios fall silent, couldn't believe what they were seeing. They watched as Hudner's Corsair dropped its nose, lined up on the steep, snow-covered slope about 100 yards from Jesse's smoking wreck, and committed to the earth. Hudner didn't have the luxury of a runway. He was landing wheels up on a mountainside, littered with boulders hidden beneath the snow. He came in fast, the wind screaming over his canopy. He flared at the last second, trying to bleed off speed, and slammed into the mountain. The impact was a car crash multiplied by 10. The Corsair plowed through the snow, the metal screeching, the propeller tearing into the frozen ground, bending back like a curled finger. The plane bucked and slid, throwing up a blizzard of white powder before grinding to a violent halt. For a second, Hudner sat there, dazed, his back aching from the impact. He checked his limbs. He was alive. He unbuckled his harness, threw open the canopy, and scrambled out into the biting cold of the North Korean winter. He didn't look at his own plane. He didn't check for damage. He just ran. He ran through the waist-deep snow, stumbling and gasping in the thin air, toward the column of smoke that marked Jesse's grave. As he got closer, the scene came into terrifying focus. Jesse's plane was a ruin. The fuselage was buckled and twisted, bent at a sickening angle directly behind the cockpit. Smoke was billowing from the engine cowling, thick and oily, carrying the acrid stench of burning aviation fuel. Hudner reached the wing and scrambled up to the cockpit. Jesse was conscious. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't panicking. He was sitting there, his helmet off, looking at Hudner with a mixture of shock and profound calm. His face was gray with cold and shock, but his eyes were clear. "Tom," he said, his voice weak, "I'm stuck." Hudner looked into the cockpit. It was a nightmare. The force of the crash had shoved the instrument panel and the fuselage inward. Jesse's right leg was crushed and pinned beneath the twisted metal of the console. He was trapped in a vise of steel. Hudner grabbed Jesse's shoulders and tried to pull. He pulled until his muscles burned, bracing his boots against the side of the plane. Jesse groaned in pain, but he didn't budge. The metal held him fast, and then the fire flared. The smoke that had been a thin trail suddenly turned into licking tongues of orange flame around the nose of the aircraft. The fuel tanks had ruptured. If the fire reached the cockpit, Jesse would burn alive. Hudner didn't have a fire extinguisher. He didn't have a hose. He had his bare hands. He jumped down from the wing and began scooping up armfuls of snow, packing it onto the engine cowling, trying to smother the flames. He worked frantically, digging into the frozen crust, throwing snow onto the hot metal. The heat seared his face, while the cold froze his hands. It was a Sisyphean task. The fire would hiss and die down for a moment, only to flare up again, fed by the leaking fuel. For 30 minutes, Tom Hudner fought the fire alone. He would shovel snow, then climb back up to the wing to try and pull Jesse free, then go back to the snow. He took off his scarf and wrapped it around Jesse's hands to keep them from freezing. He took off his own wool watch cap and pulled it down over Jesse's ears. They were two men alone at the end of the world, surrounded by silence and snow, fighting a battle against physics. "We're going to get you out, Jesse," Hudner promised, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Help is coming." Jesse looked at him. The pain must have been excruciating. The cold seeping into his shattered leg, the heat of the fire threatening his face. But he remained stoic. He didn't ask Tom why he had crashed his plane. He didn't tell him to leave. He just accepted the presence of his friend. In that frozen valley, the racial divide of America was a concept as distant as the moon. There was no black, there was no white. There was only the man trapped in the machine and the man trying to free him. Overhead, the other pilots had radioed for a rescue helicopter. It was a long shot. Helicopters in 1950 were primitive machines, fragile and underpowered. Flying one into the mountains of North Korea, into enemy territory, at that altitude, was dangerous. But the call went out. Mayday. 2 pilots down. After what felt like an eternity, the distinctive thwop 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 of rotor blades cut through the wind. A Marine helicopter, piloted by Lieutenant Charlie Ward, appeared over the ridge. It was a fragile dragonfly against the massive peaks. Ward fought the downdrafts and set the chopper down in the clearing, the rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of snow. Ward jumped out, carrying a fire extinguisher and a fire axe. He ran to the wreck. Now there were 2 men working to save Jesse. Ward sprayed the extinguisher into the engine, momentarily knocking back the flames. Then he handed the axe to Hudner. "Try to cut him out," Ward yelled over the wind. Hudner swung the axe. He struck the side of the fuselage, aiming for the metal sheeting that was pinning Jesse's leg. Clang! The axe bounced off. The Corsair was built to survive anti-aircraft fire. Its skin was tough aluminum alloy. The axe dented it, scratched it, but couldn't cut it. Hudner swung again and again, desperation lending him strength. He hacked at the metal until his hands blistered, until the shock of the impacts rattled his bones. But the plane wouldn't yield. It held Jesse in a cold, iron grip. The sun began to dip below the ridgeline. The temperature, already deadly, began to plummet. It was dropping towards 0, then 10 below, then 20. The darkness was coming, and with it, the Chinese troops. They had to be close. They would have seen the smoke, seen the helicopter. Jesse was fading. The shock and the cold were shutting down his body. His speech was becoming slurred. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Hudner kept talking to him, trying to keep him awake. "Stay with me, Jesse. Stay with me." Ward, the helicopter pilot, looked at Hudner. His face was grim. "We can't stay, Lieutenant," he said. "The chopper can't fly in these mountains at night. The brakes on the rotor are freezing up. If we don't leave now, we're all going to die here." Hudner looked at Ward, then looked at Jesse. The fire was flaring up again, the heat radiating against his face. He looked at the axe, useless in his hand. He looked at the snow, stained with oil and soot. He realized, with a hollow, sickening thud in his gut, that he had failed. He had crashed his plane. He had burned his hands. He had fought with everything he had, and he had failed. He couldn't save him. He leaned into the cockpit, close to Jesse's face. Jesse's eyes were half closed. He was dying. Hudner knew it. Jesse knew it. "Jesse," Hudner said, his voice choking, "we have to go. We can't get you out." It was the hardest sentence Thomas Hudner ever spoke. It was a betrayal of everything he believed in, every code of the wingman, every instinct of brotherhood. But the alternative was 3 frozen corpses instead of 1. Jesse Brown looked at him. He didn't beg. He didn't cry out in fear. He gathered the last of his strength, the final reserves of the will that had carried him from the cotton fields to the clouds. He looked Tom Hudner in the eye, and he whispered his final command. It wasn't a plea for his life. It was a plea for his legacy. "Just tell Daisy how much I love her." Those were his last words. Hudner nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I will," he promised. "I will." He stood up. He didn't want to let go of the cockpit rail. Leaving Jesse there, trapped, alone, freezing, while the fire licked closer, was a physical agony. It felt like tearing off his own limb. But Ward was pulling at his arm. "We have to go, Tom. Now!" Hudner stepped down from the wing. He looked back one last time. Jesse was slumped forward, unconscious now, finding peace in the darkness before the end. The smoke swirled around him like a shroud. Hudner ran to the helicopter. He climbed in, shivering violently, not just from the cold, but from the trauma. As the helicopter lifted off, struggling into the thin, freezing air, Tom Hudner looked down through the plexiglass. He saw the two broken Corsairs in the snow. He saw the smoke rising into the twilight. He saw his friend, the first black carrier pilot in history, the man he had come to love like a brother, getting smaller and smaller until he was just a dark speck in the vast, indifferent white wilderness. The flight back to the base was a blur. Hudner sat in silence, the vibration of the helicopter rattling his teeth. He was alive. He was going back to warmth, to food, to safety. But he had left a piece of his soul on that mountain. He had gone in to be a hero, to perform a miracle, and he had been forced to accept the brutal, indifferent reality of war. He had promised to watch Jesse's back, and now Jesse was gone. But the story didn't end in the helicopter. When Hudner landed, when he stumbled out into the lights of the base, his face blackened with soot, his hands burned, he didn't ask for a doctor. He went straight to the commanding officer. He had a request. He wasn't done fighting for Jesse Brown. If he couldn't save his life, he was damn well going to save his dignity. He demanded that they send a recovery team. He demanded they go back for the body. He wasn't going to let the Chinese parade Jesse Brown through the streets as a trophy. He wasn't going to let the first black naval aviator disappear into an unmarked grave in a hostile land. He wanted his brother back. And he was willing to go back into the fire to get him. The captain of the USS Leyte listened to Thomas Hudner's plea with a heavy heart. He saw the desperation in the young lieutenant's eyes, the soot stains on his face, the bandages on his frozen, burned hands. Hudner wasn't asking for a medal. He was asking for a helicopter, a platoon, a tank, anything to go back up that mountain and retrieve the body of Ensign Jesse Brown. But the captain had a broader view of the battlefield, and the picture was catastrophic. The Chinese forces were swarming over the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines on the ground were fighting a rearguard action just to avoid annihilation. Sending a rescue team back into that specific valley, which was now deep behind enemy lines, was not a risk. It was a suicide mission. It would almost certainly result in more dead Americans. The captain made the only decision a commander could make. He said no, but he understood the code of the aviator. He understood that you do not leave a man behind to be paraded as a trophy by the enemy. If they couldn't bring Jesse home, they would ensure that his resting place was sacred, untouched, and final. They would give him a warrior's funeral, the only kind they could provide from the air. The order was given to the squadron. They were to load their Corsairs not with bombs for the enemy, but with napalm for their brother. On December 7th, 1950, 3 days after the crash, a division of VF-32 pilots took off from the deck of the Leyte. Tom Hudner, grounded by his injuries, stood on the bridge and watched them go, his heart breaking all over again. The planes flew low over the crash site. The scene was frozen in time. Jesse's body was still in the cockpit, covered in snow, a dark statue amidst the white. His plane was his coffin. The Chinese, perhaps sensing the trap or respecting the dead, had stripped some clothing from the body, but had not yet removed him from the wreck. The lead pilot radioed the group. There was no combat chatter, no tactical brevity, just a heavy, solemn silence. They circled the site, dipping their wings in a final salute. Then, the leader began to recite the Lord's Prayer over the open radio channel. Our Father, who art in heaven. As the words crackled through the headsets of the pilots, the Corsairs rolled in. They didn't dive with the aggression of an attack. They descended with the gravity of pallbearers. They released the canisters of napalm. The jellied gasoline tumbled down, striking the two wrecked aircraft, Jesse's and Tom's, and erupting in a brilliant, cleansing wall of fire. The flames consumed everything. They consumed the plane that had carried Jesse Brown from the cotton fields to the edge of space. They consumed the body that had been broken by the crash and the cold. It was a Viking funeral in the frozen wasteland of North Korea, a pyre that burned bright enough to be seen for miles. To some, it might seem like a violent end, but to the men of the squadron, it was an act of profound love. They were ensuring that no enemy hand would ever touch Jesse Brown again. He belonged to the fire, and he belonged to the sky. Tom Hudner returned to the United States a hero, though he never felt like one. On April 13, 1951, he stood in the Rose Garden of the White House. President Harry S. Truman, the man who had desegregated the armed forces, draped the Medal of Honor around Hudner's neck. He was the first Navy serviceman to receive the medal in the Korean War. The citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. But as Hudner stood there, shaking the president's hand, looking out at the press corps, he felt a hollow ache in his chest. The medal was heavy, but the absence of the man standing next to him was heavier. He told the reporters, quietly, "I just couldn't save him." But Tom Hudner had one more mission to complete. He had a promise to keep. He traveled to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. For a white naval officer in 1951 to travel to the Deep South to visit a black woman was not a simple social call. It was a transgression of the highest order. The racial lines in Mississippi were drawn in concrete, but Hudner didn't care. He went to find Daisy Brown. When they met, the moment was fraught with a tension that transcended race. She was the widow. Young and beautiful, holding the daughter Jesse had adored. He was the man who had been with her husband at the end, the man who had lived while Jesse had died. Daisy could have been bitter. She could have asked why the white man survived. But when Tom looked at her and delivered Jesse's final message, "Tell Daisy I love her," the walls crumbled. They wept together. In that living room in Mississippi, the sharecropper's widow and the Harvard heir were bound together by a grief that knew no color. Tom Hudner didn't just deliver a message. He delivered a piece of Jesse back to her. He told her about Jesse's bravery, about his skill, about how much he was respected. He made sure she knew that her husband hadn't died alone, that he had been held in the arms of a friend. Daisy Brown would go on to live a long life, raising Pamela to be the strong woman Jesse had dreamed she would be. She never remarried. She attended the dedication ceremonies. She kept the scrapbook. She polished the legacy. And Tom Hudner stayed by her side, figuratively and literally, for the rest of his life. He helped her navigate the bureaucracy to get benefits. He appeared with her at memorials. He became a grandfather figure to Pamela. He proved that the bond forged in the cockpit didn't end when the engine stopped. The Navy, to its credit, eventually recognized what it had lost. In 1973, the USS Jesse L. Brown was commissioned. It was a Knox-class frigate, the first USS Navy ship ever named after an African-American officer. Think about the magnitude of that. A Navy that had once refused to let a black man eat in the mess hall now had a warship bearing a black man's name patrolling the oceans. Thousands of white sailors would serve aboard her, wearing caps with Jesse Brown's name on them, saluting the flag on a fantail that honored a sharecropper's son. It was a transformation that Jesse himself could scarcely have imagined as he scrubbed dishes in the Ohio State cafeteria. But Tom Hudner wasn't done. The memory of leaving Jesse on that mountain haunted him. He grew old, his hair turning white, his gait slowing, but the fire of that day in 1950 never went out. In 2013, at the age of 88, Thomas Hudner did the unthinkable. He went back to North Korea. It was a diplomatic miracle, arranged after years of negotiation. The Hermit Kingdom, the enemy he had fought, allowed this old warrior to return to the Chosin Reservoir. He wanted to find the wreck. He wanted to find Jesse's bones and bring them home. He stood on that snowy mountain again, the wind biting at his face, just as it had 63 years earlier. He looked out over the silent, frozen landscape. The technology and the politics had changed, but the mountain was the same. They didn't find the body. The seasons, the scavengers, and the farming of the land had likely claimed what the fire hadn't. But standing there, Tom Hudner found something else. He found peace. He spoke into the wind, his voice cracking with age and emotion. "Jesse," he said, "we came back for you." He had kept his word. He had proven that Semper Fidelis, always faithful, was not just a motto for the Marines, but a way of life for anyone who truly understood the meaning of brotherhood. The story of Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner is often framed as a tragedy, and it is tragic. A brilliant young life was cut short. A father was taken from his daughter. A talent was extinguished by a random bullet. But to see it only as a tragedy is to miss the point. It is, fundamentally, a love story. Not a romantic love, but the Greek agape, a selfless, brotherly love that transcends self-preservation. In a time when America was tearing itself apart over the question of whether a black man was equal to a white man, Tom Hudner answered the question without saying a word. He didn't write a law. He didn't lead a protest. He simply crashed his plane. He staked his life on the belief that Jesse Brown's life was worth just as much as his own. He bled into the same snow. He burned his hands in the same fire. This is the legacy they leave us. It is a challenge. It asks us, who would you crash your plane for? Would you risk everything for someone who looks nothing like you, who comes from a different world, who society tells you is less than you? Jesse Brown broke the barrier of the sky. He proved that gravity doesn't discriminate. He showed that a man born in the mud can learn to fly. But Tom Hudner broke the barrier of the heart. He proved that loyalty doesn't discriminate. He showed that when the chips are down, when the fire is rising, and the darkness is closing in, we are all just fragile creatures shivering in the cold. And the only thing that warms us, the only thing that saves us, is the hand of the person next to us. They told Jesse Brown he belonged to the earth. He proved he belonged to the sky. They told Tom Hudner he belonged to the elite. He proved he belonged to his brother. The wreckage of their planes is gone, swallowed by the North Korean soil. But the story remains. It stands as a monument taller than any mountain in Chosin. It is a beacon that shines as bright as the napalm that burned on that dark December afternoon. It tells us that while hatred is strong, and war is terrible, and death is inevitable, there is one thing, one fragile, beautiful, human thing, that is stronger than all of them: devotion. Jesse Brown is still up there, flying wingtip to wingtip with history. And Tom Hudner is finally there with him. The section reunited, the long patrol finished. They are climbing into the sun, leaving the shadows of race and war far below. Two aviators, two friends, two Americans, finally and forever free.